September 4th, 476 AD, a teenage boy sits on a throne he was never meant to keep. His name is Romulus Augustulus, a name almost cruel in its irony. Romulus after the legendary founder of Rome, Augustus after the greatest emperor who ever ruled it, and yet this boy would be the last. Within hours, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer would walk through the palace doors, strip him of his title, and send him into exile with a pension. No battle, no dramatic last stand, no burning of the city, just a quiet, bureaucratic ending to what had once been the most powerful civilization in human history. But here's the question that actually matters. How does something that vast, that durable, that engineered for permanence simply stop existing? The easy answer, the one most people reach for, is invasion. The barbarians came and Rome fell, but that answer is almost entirely wrong, or at the very least it is catastrophically incomplete. Barbarians had been pressing against Rome's borders for centuries. Rome had absorbed, repelled, and integrated countless waves of external pressure. The invasion didn't break Rome. Rome had already broken from the inside across multiple generations through compounding structural failures that no single emperor could reverse. This is the story of how a system built to last forever collapsed under the weight of its own design flaws, its own political toxicity, and its own impossible scale. To understand why Rome fell, you first have to understand how Rome rose. And to understand how Rome rose, you have to go back before Augustus, before the emperors, to the moment when Rome was still a republic and why that republic shattered. For nearly 5 centuries, Rome was governed as a republic. It was a system built on the principle that no single man should hold absolute power. 2 consuls were elected annually. The Senate deliberated. Laws were passed, armies were levied, and the machinery of state operated through a web of competing magistrates who checked each other at every turn. It was imperfect, often corrupt, always noisy, but it was stable precisely because it distributed power across enough hands that no single point of failure could bring it down. But the Republic had a fundamental design flaw that became catastrophic once Rome started winning wars at scale. Conquest generated wealth, wealth concentrated, concentration of wealth produced political inequality, and political inequality over time produced men who were powerful enough to make the Republic unworkable. By the 1st century BC, Rome had become an empire in all but name, a Mediterranean superpower governed by an increasingly dysfunctional republic whose institutions were being bent, broken, and weaponized by ambitious men with private armies. Julius Caesar was the most visible symptom of that collapse, not the cause. When he crossed the Rubicon in 49 BC and marched on Rome, he was not acting without precedent. Sulla had done it before him, Marius had done it before Sulla. The Republic had been fracturing for decades, Caesar simply finished it. His assassination in 44 BC did not restore the Republic. It triggered a final cycle of civil wars that lasted another 13 years, consumed hundreds of thousands of lives, and produced ultimately one survivor. His name was Octavian, and what he built from the wreckage of the Republic would define the next 5 centuries of Western civilization. The genius of Augustus, the name the Senate gave Octavian in 27 BC, was not military power. It was institutional theater. Augustus understood that Romans were psychologically attached to the Republic. They would not accept a king. They would not accept a dictator, which was the word that had gotten his adoptive father killed. So he invented something new. He kept all the forms of the Republic, the Senate, the consuls, the elections, and hollowed them out from the inside. He held the power of the tribunes, which gave him veto over any law. He held the power of proconsular command, which gave him control of the armies. He called himself not king, not dictator, but princeps, first citizen. It was, in the most elegant possible way, an absolute monarchy disguised as a constitutional government, and it worked remarkably well. The period that followed, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, lasted roughly 2 centuries, from the reign of Augustus to the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 AD. During this period, the empire expanded to its greatest territorial extent, reaching from Scotland in the northwest to Mesopotamia in the east. Trade networks stretched from Britain to India. Cities bloomed across the provinces. Roman law, Roman engineering, Roman culture spread across 3 continents. It was, by almost any historical measure, one of the most successful political experiments in human history. But the peace was always more fragile than it appeared, and the seeds of Rome's eventual destruction were planted right here, at the height of its power, in the structure Augustus built and the precedents he set. The first and most consequential structural flaw was the question of succession. Rome had no reliable system for determining who would become emperor when the current one died. Augustus solved this in his own lifetime by carefully maneuvering his stepson Tiberius into position, adopting him legally, granting him tribunician power, ensuring that when Augustus died in 14 AD, the transition would be smooth. And it was. But this was a personal solution, not an institutional one. It depended entirely on the emperor having the foresight, the political skill, and the biological luck to identify and install an appropriate successor. Tiberius was capable but cold. His reign was marked by increasing paranoia and the rise of treason trials that killed senators and knights on flimsy pretexts. He retreated to the island of Capri for the last decade of his rule, effectively governing the empire from a remote villa while his agents in Rome wielded his authority with unchecked brutality. When he died in 37 AD, he left behind a system that had already begun to curdle. What came next was Caligula, possibly the most catastrophically unstable ruler in Roman history. Within months of taking power, he began executing rivals, demanding divine honors, and making decisions that seemed to deliberately destabilize the institutions around him. Whether he was genuinely mentally ill, deliberately performing tyranny as a political strategy, or simply a young man drunk on unlimited power with no institutional checks whatsoever, historians still debate. What matters is that his reign revealed something terrifying. The system Augustus built had no mechanism to remove a bad emperor, no recall, no constitutional check, nothing except assassination, which is exactly how Caligula's reign ended in 41 AD. His successor, Claudius, was more competent, a scholar who had been overlooked precisely because he seemed harmless. Under Claudius, Rome completed the conquest of Britain in 43 AD and continued expanding its administrative reach across the provinces. He was, by most accounts, a genuinely effective administrator, but he was elevated to power not by democratic choice, not by institutional process, but by the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal bodyguard unit stationed in Rome. That precedent was catastrophic. It established clearly and permanently that the real power behind the throne was whoever controlled the soldiers closest to it. Nero followed. His reign began promisingly, guided in its early years by the philosopher Seneca and the capable general Burrus, who managed the actual business of empire while Nero indulged his artistic ambitions. But as Nero consolidated power and eliminated rivals, including his own mother Agrippina, the administration deteriorated. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD destroyed much of the city, and Nero's response, whether he started it or not, the ancient sources are genuinely contradictory, became a political catastrophe. He blamed the Christians, initiating the first imperial persecution of that community, and used the burned districts to build an enormous private palace called the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. The optics were ruinous. By 68 AD, military commanders across the empire were in revolt. Nero, abandoned by the Praetorian Guard, fled Rome and died by suicide, the last of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. What followed was a year that shook the empire to its foundations. 69 AD, the year of the 4 emperors. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian each claimed the throne in rapid succession. 3 died violently within months. The lesson of 69 AD was one the empire never fully recovered from. Emperors could be made by the legions. If your soldiers were loyal to you personally, you could march on Rome and seize power. If they weren't, someone else's soldiers would. This turned every ambitious general into a potential emperor and every provincial governor into a political risk. Vespasian ultimately prevailed, founding the Flavian dynasty and stabilizing the empire. His son Titus presided over the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, following the first Jewish revolt, an event of enormous religious and cultural significance that fundamentally reshaped Judaism and created the conditions for early Christianity's rapid spread across the empire. His younger son Domitian succeeded him and ruled capably but brutally, before being assassinated in 96 AD, after which the Senate selected a succession of emperors by adoption rather than blood. This experiment in meritocratic succession, selecting the best available man rather than relying on biological inheritance, produced what Edward Gibbon famously called the 5 good emperors: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. It was arguably the most effective government Rome ever had. Trajan, who ruled from 98 to 117 AD, was a military genius who expanded the empire to its absolute maximum territorial extent. He conquered Dacia, modern Romania, in 2 devastating campaigns between 101 and 106 AD. He pushed east, taking Armenia, Mesopotamia, and briefly reaching the Persian Gulf. Roman territory at its peak covered nearly 5 million square kilometers. The empire held something like 70 million people. It was, by the standards of the ancient world, almost incomprehensibly vast. But Trajan's expansion also revealed a tension that would haunt Rome for the rest of its existence. Larger borders required more soldiers to defend them. More soldiers required more money. More money required either heavier taxation or more conquest to generate new revenue. Conquest, however, was not infinitely sustainable. Trajan's successor Hadrian recognized this immediately. Hadrian reversed nearly all of Trajan's eastern conquests, retreated to defensible lines, and spent his reign consolidating rather than expanding. He built his famous wall across northern Britain not as a monument to Roman power, but as an acknowledgement of its limits. This is as far as we go. Hadrian's consolidation was strategically wise, but it also set a precedent of retreat that, once begun, would prove difficult to reverse. It was Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, the last of the 5 good emperors, who most clearly saw the structural contradictions his civilization had built itself upon. His meditations, written privately, never meant for publication, reveal a man laboring to apply Stoic philosophy to the brutal realities of governance. He ruled from 161 to 180 AD, and his reign was defined not by glory but by crisis. The Antonine Plague, likely smallpox, possibly measles, swept through the empire starting around 165 AD, killing an estimated 5 to 10 million people over 15 years. Some regions lost a third of their population. The army was devastated. Agricultural production collapsed in affected areas, and simultaneously Germanic tribes were pressing hard against the Danube frontier with unprecedented coordination and aggression. Marcus spent most of his reign on military campaign, not conquest, defense. He was trying to hold a line. He succeeded, but barely, and at enormous cost. When he died in 180 AD, he left a stable but exhausted empire and made one fateful decision that would accelerate everything that followed. He chose not to adopt a capable successor. He allowed his biological son, Commodus, to inherit the throne. Commodus was not incompetent in the conventional sense. He was something arguably more dangerous, a man with absolute power who simply did not care about governing. He delegated administration to favorites while dedicating himself to public spectacle, most notoriously fighting as a gladiator in the arena. Behavior that Romans of the senatorial class found not just eccentric but deeply humiliating. He renamed Rome after himself. He renamed the months after himself. He declared himself the reincarnation of Hercules. The Senate despised him. The Praetorian Guard conspired against him. He was strangled in his bath on New Year's Eve, 192 AD. His death triggered what historians call the Year of the 5 Emperors in 193 AD. Another convulsion of civil war. Another demonstration that the succession problem had never been solved. What matters here is not just who won. Septimius Severus, a North African general of Punic and Italian descent who marched on Rome, seized power, and ruled until 211 AD, but what his victory represented. Severus was openly contemptuous of the Senate. He relied entirely on military loyalty, increasing soldiers' pay significantly and expanding the army. His reported deathbed advice to his sons: be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all other men. It was a formula for military autocracy, and his sons took it seriously. His elder son Caracalla was among the most complex emperors Rome produced. Cruel, impulsive, and genuinely feared, he eliminated rivals, including his own brother Geta, whom he had murdered in their mother's arms. But Caracalla also issued one of the most consequential legal edicts in Roman history, the Constitutio Antoniniana of 212 AD, which extended Roman citizenship to virtually every free inhabitant of the empire. The ancient meaningful distinction between Roman and non-Roman was dissolved. Every free man in Britain, in Syria, in Egypt, and North Africa was now legally a Roman citizen. Historians debate the motivations. The traditional view is that Caracalla was primarily interested in expanding the tax base. Roman citizens paid inheritance taxes, and widening citizenship widened revenue, but the effects went far beyond finance. It was a profound statement about what Rome was and who belonged to it, and paradoxically, by making citizenship universal, it began to drain citizenship of its meaning as a source of civic identity and loyalty. Caracalla was assassinated in 217 AD. What followed was acceleration, a blur of short reigns, military coups, and provincial rebellions that historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, running roughly from 235 to 284 AD. In those 50 years, Rome had over 20 emperors. Most died violently. The average reign was around 2 years. The instability was not merely political, it was systemic. Every time a general declared himself emperor, he pulled his legions away from the frontier to march on Rome, leaving the borders undefended. Every civil war disrupted the tax collection and agricultural supply chains that fed the armies. Every new emperor, needing to reward the soldiers who put him in power, debased the currency to pay them, shaving silver content from coins, inflating the money supply, triggering price spirals that devastated the urban poor and the fixed income class. The most visible structural failure of the 3rd century was fragmentation. In 260 AD, the empire simultaneously broke into 3 pieces. In the east, the Palmyrene Empire under Queen Zenobia detached from Rome and controlled Syria, Egypt, and much of Asia Minor. In the west, the Gallic Empire under Postumus controlled Gaul, Britain, and Spain. Rome itself controlled only Italy, North Africa, and the Balkans. For over a decade, the Mediterranean world that Augustus had unified was split among 3 competing governments. That a single emperor, Aurelian, one of the most capable military commanders the 3rd century produced, could reunite all 3 within a few years between 270 and 274 AD is itself remarkable. It demonstrates that the empire's institutional gravity was still powerful, that provinces and cities still defined themselves in Roman terms, still wanted to be Roman. The desire to be part of Rome outlasted the ability of Rome to hold itself together, but Aurelian's reunion was built on military force, not institutional repair. The underlying causes of fragmentation, political instability, currency debasement, border pressure, declining civic identity, remained entirely unaddressed. The man who finally confronted those structural problems directly was Diocletian, who seized power in 284 AD and ruled with enormous consequential decisions until 305 AD. Diocletian understood that the empire had become too large for one man to govern. His solution was the tetrarchy, the rule of 4. He divided the empire administratively into 4 sections, each governed by either an Augustus or a Caesar, with clear hierarchical relationships and theoretically a mechanism for managed succession. It was the most creative institutional reform the empire had seen since Augustus himself. He also massively expanded the bureaucracy, doubled the size of the army, reorganized the tax system to operate in kind rather than in debased coin, and initiated a sweeping persecution of Christians, the largest and most systematic such persecution Rome had ever conducted. That last decision, the Diocletianic persecution, which began in 303 AD, reflected Diocletian's understanding of Christianity as a competing loyalty structure that threatened imperial unity. He was not entirely wrong, but the persecution failed. It produced martyrs rather than compliance, strengthened rather than weakened the Christian community, and the official persecution was abandoned before it achieved its goals. Diocletian's tetrarchy collapsed almost immediately after he retired. A voluntary retirement, unprecedented in Roman history, to his palace and split on the Dalmatian coast. The carefully designed succession system broke down within a decade into civil war. What emerged from the wreckage was Constantine, who won a series of civil conflicts to become sole emperor of the reunited empire by 324 AD. Constantine's significance is almost impossible to overstate. In 313 AD, he issued the Edict of Milan jointly with his co-emperor Licinius, establishing religious tolerance throughout the empire and effectively ending the persecution of Christians. Within years, Constantine was not merely tolerating Christianity, he was actively sponsoring it, building churches, convening councils, integrating Christian clergy into the imperial administrative apparatus. His motivations were complex and probably mixed: genuine religious conversion, political calculation, or some combination that even he might not have been able to disentangle. But what matters is what happened as a result. Christianity went from persecuted minority to state religion with astonishing speed. The institutional church and the imperial government became intertwined in ways that would define European civilization for the next 1,000 years. And Constantine made another decision of enormous lasting consequence. He moved the capital. He founded Constantinople on the Bosphorus, on the site of the Greek city Byzantium, and declared it the new Rome. The city was inaugurated in 330 AD. It was strategically positioned to command the major trade and military routes between Europe and Asia, defensible on three sides by water, surrounded by rich agricultural territories in Anatolia and the Balkans. It was, in military and economic terms, a superior capital. But what did it mean for the old Rome, for Italy, for the western provinces that had always thought of themselves as the heart of the empire? The shift of the capital eastward was not just geographic, it was a statement about where the empire's center of gravity truly lay. The east was richer, the east was more densely urbanized, the east had older, more sophisticated cities and administrative traditions. The west, Britain, Gaul, Spain, much of North Africa, was comparatively less developed, more agricultural, more dependent on imperial investment that was increasingly flowing east. When Theodosius I died in 395 AD, he divided the empire between his two sons. Arcadius received the east, Honorius the west. This was not the first such division. Emperors had shared power before, but it proved to be permanent. The western and eastern halves never reunited under a single ruler again, and from this point forward their trajectories diverged sharply. The Eastern Empire, which we now call Byzantium, though its inhabitants always called it Rome, was wealthy, urbanized, and defensible. It would survive for another 1,000 years until the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453. The Western Empire, by contrast, was increasingly cash-poor, sparsely administered, and dependent on barbarian federates. Germanic warriors settled within Roman territory who agreed to fight for Rome in exchange for land, to staff its armies. The key issue was that these federates were loyal to their commanders, not to the abstract idea of Rome. They fought for the men who paid them. When the Western government stopped being able to pay them reliably, that loyalty became negotiable. The man who captured this transition most completely was Alaric I, king of the Visigoths. Alaric had served in the Roman army. He knew Roman military organization, Roman tactics, Roman supply systems. He had fought for Rome in the Balkans and had been promised the military command he believed his service deserved. When that promise was repeatedly broken by Western courts more interested in internal politics than competent military administration, he turned his forces against Rome itself. He besieged the city twice before finally sacking it on August 24th, 410 AD. The sack of Rome in 410 was the first time the city had been taken by a foreign enemy in 800 years, since the Gauls in 390 BC. Its psychological impact was staggering. St. Jerome, writing in Bethlehem when he heard the news, wrote that the world had gone dark. The city that had called itself eternal had fallen to a man who had once been Rome's own soldier. The symbolic weight was crushing. But equally important is what the sack revealed practically. The Western government was no longer capable of defending its own capital. Alaric had not overwhelmed Rome through superior force. He had exploited Rome's inability to coordinate its own defense. What followed the 410 sacking was not immediate collapse, but slow unraveling. The Western court, relocated to the heavily fortified city of Ravenna in the Po Valley, continued to produce emperors, but real power increasingly resided with military commanders, most of them of barbarian origin, who governed in the emperor's name while making all actual decisions. The most capable of these, Aetius, sometimes called the last of the Romans, managed to organize one final great victory, the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in 451 AD, where a coalition of Roman and Visigothic forces defeated Attila the Hun. Attila was a different kind of threat than Rome had faced before. The Huns, a nomadic confederation from the Eurasian steppe, had been pushing westward since the late 4th century, displacing Germanic tribes who in turn pressed against Roman borders. The Hunnic cavalry was among the most mobile and tactically sophisticated military forces in the ancient world. Attila combined genuine military genius with extraordinary political skill, building a multi-ethnic confederation held together by his personal authority and the promise of plunder. His invasion of Gaul in 451 devastated the region, and only the coalition assembled by Aetius, including Visigoths, Burgundians, Franks, and whatever Roman forces could be scraped together, stopped him at the Catalonian plains near modern Chalon. But the victory was incomplete. Attila retreated, reorganized, and invaded Italy the following year, sacking numerous cities before withdrawing, possibly due to disease, supply difficulties, or the embassy of Pope Leo I, whose legendary intervention Attila agreed to honor. The historical reality of Leo's role is debated. What is certain is that Attila left Italy without sacking Rome and died the following year in 453, possibly of a nosebleed on his wedding night. His confederation collapsed almost immediately. The Hunnic threat was over, but the Western Empire was spent. Aetius, who had engineered the victory that saved Gaul, was murdered by the Emperor Valentinian III in 454 AD. The emperor, afraid of a general who had become more powerful than himself. Valentinian was himself murdered the following year. The Western Empire in its final decades was not governed so much as consumed by its own dysfunction. Emperors were made and unmade by Germanic commanders. Tax collection had effectively stopped functioning across large areas of Gaul and Spain, which were now de facto kingdoms under Visigothic, Burgundian, and Vandal control. The administrative infrastructure, the roads, the postal system, the courts, the monetary economy was deteriorating at an accelerating rate as the tax revenue needed to maintain it dried up. The lesser known but perhaps more structurally important collapse was economic. Rome's monetary system had been under pressure since the 3rd century, when currency debasement had triggered chronic inflation. By the 5th century, the coin-based tax system was increasingly dysfunctional in the West. Wealthy landowners retreated to their rural estates, which became increasingly self-sufficient. The commercial networks that had connected cities across the empire contracted. Urban populations declined as the economic logic of city living weakened. What was happening, in structural terms, was a decomplexification of the system, the elaborate division of labor and exchange that made imperial civilization possible was reverting to simpler, more localized patterns of production and consumption. This is why, when Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus in 476 AD, there was no war, no great battle, no dramatic last stand. There was simply a Germanic commander who had been effective military power in Italy for years, dealing with a titular emperor who represented nothing that still functioned. Odoacer sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, to the Eastern Emperor Zeno. with a note explaining that the Western Empire no longer required a separate emperor, and that he would govern Italy as the Eastern Emperor's representative. Zeno accepted this arrangement, more or less. Rome had not been conquered. It had been quietly filed away. The traditional date of 476 AD as the fall of the Western Roman Empire is somewhat artificial. Historians continue to debate whether it should be placed earlier or later, whether the empire transformed rather than fell, whether the political changes were as significant as the economic and cultural ones. What is certain is that the institutional apparatus, the taxes, the armies, the courts, the roads, the postal system that defined the Roman state collapsed in the West over roughly the 5th century, and the world that replaced it was organized differently, on a smaller scale, around local lords and local communities rather than continental governance. The Eastern Empire continued for another 1,000 years. Greek became its primary language, its art and architecture evolved, its legal tradition preserved and transmitted Roman law to the medieval world. When scholars in the Renaissance reached back to the classical tradition they were trying to revive, much of what they found had been preserved in Constantinople. The civilization was continuous even as the Western institutional structure was not. But Rome's collapse carried lessons that resonated across subsequent centuries and still echo today. The most important of them is not about barbarian invasions or corrupt emperors. It is about systemic fragility, about what happens when a political system lacks reliable mechanisms for leadership transition, when military and economic power become decoupled from legitimate governance, when the currency that enables complex exchange is debased until it no longer functions, when the gap between the center's ambitions and its actual administrative capacity grows too wide to bridge. Rome did not fall because the barbarians were stronger. In many cases, they were not. The barbarian groups that entered the empire in the 5th century were often smaller in number and less technologically sophisticated than the Roman military at its height. Rome fell because the system that had once integrated, organized, and directed those military and economic resources had lost the coherence to do so anymore. The armies fought each other instead of the frontiers. The tax collectors served local power brokers instead of the central treasury. The emperors who should have been making strategic decisions about the whole were instead surviving day to day against the next conspiracy. The tragedy of Rome is not that it was defeated, it is that it largely defeated itself across centuries of decisions that each seemed locally rational, each seemed manageable in the moment, but collectively accumulated into a structural failure from which there was no recovery. Augustus built a system capable of extraordinary things, but he also built a system with a fundamental flaw at its center, one that depended on the quality of the man at the top, had no reliable way to ensure that man would be capable, and no institutional mechanism to constrain him when he was not. Every other failure, the currency debasement, the frontier instability, the civil wars, the economic contraction, can be traced back in some way to that original design problem. The system was only as good as its emperor, and Rome was not always lucky enough to have good ones. 476 AD was not a beginning, it was a culmination. The long, slow, compounding consequence of half a millennium of structural decisions, political failures, and institutional erosion. The eternal city was never destroyed. It was simply, finally, left behind. And in the silence that followed, something new. Medieval Europe, Byzantine civilization, early Islam, the dispersed church began, slowly and haltingly, to fill the space that Rome had left. The empire was over, but what it had built, in law, in language, in infrastructure, in the idea that a single political order could govern people across a vast geographic and cultural expanse, never entirely disappeared. It became the inheritance that every subsequent civilization in the Western world would claim, contest, and try, in its own way, to recover. That inheritance is still with us, and it began and ended with one simple catastrophic truth. Systems do not fall when they are attacked from outside. They fall when they can no longer hold themselves together from within.